Got humiliated by my strict teacher in front of the whole class. Found out she was dealing with something serious. Saw her mysteriously disappear and learned a life lesson I never expected. I've never been a troublemaker. If anything, I'm the quiet kid, the one teachers barely notice. But somehow, that didn't stop Ms. Harper from making an example out of me. It happened on a random Wednesday. We were going over a math problem on the board when Ms. Harper called on me to answer. I hesitated, shifting in my seat. I think it's 36. Ms. Harper smiled, but not in a nice way. It was the kind of smile that made your stomach twist, the kind that told you she was setting you up for something. Wrong, she said, dragging out the word. Not even close. Do you even pay attention in class, Tom? A few kids chuckled. My face burned. I've been paying attention. I just got nervous when put on the spot. But before I could say anything, Ms. Harper turned to the rest of the class. See, everyone, this is what happens when you don't study. You end up guessing and embarrassing yourself. The laughter grew louder. My ears were ringing. My hands clenched into fists under my desk. I wanted to disappear. From that day on, she seemed to have it out for me. Whenever I hesitated, she'd sigh dramatically. If I asked a question, she'd roll her eyes. It wasn't enough to get her in trouble, but enough to make every second in her class feel like torture. Then, one afternoon, I found out something that changed everything. It was after school, and I had forgotten my history textbook in the classroom. When I went back to get it, the door was slightly open. Inside, Ms. Harper was on the phone, pacing. I told you I can't do this right now, she snapped. No, I don't care if he's mad. He can take me to court if he wants. I'm not giving him a dime. I froze, gripping the strap of my backpack. I had never seen her like this. She looked completely different from the strict, put-together teacher I knew in class. Her usually perfect bun was messy, and her voice was shaking. I don't have it, okay? She hissed. I barely make enough as it is. Silence. Then, in a much quieter voice, she said, I can't go back to him. I realized I was holding my breath. Slowly, I backed away from the door and left, my history book completely forgotten. That night, I lay awake, thinking about what I had heard. Miss Harper was always cold, always in control. But today, she sounded scared, helpless, like someone who had lost everything. The next day, when she called on me in class, I didn't flinch. I answered as best I could, and when she sighed in that exasperated way, I just stared at her. And for the first time, I didn't see a villain. I saw someone barely holding it together. She was cruel, sure, but maybe that was because she didn't know how else to be. I never told anyone what I heard that day. But from then on, when Ms. Harper rolled her eyes at me, I just nodded and got back to work. Because in a strange way, I finally understood. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. From that day on, something changed, not in Ms. Harper, but in me. I didn't start liking her, and she definitely didn't go easier on me. But every time she snapped at me, every time she made some sarcastic comment about my work, I didn't take it personally anymore. Instead of getting angry, I started noticing things, like how she rubbed her temples after grading papers, or how she sometimes stared blankly at the board before starting class, like she wasn't really there. I noticed the dark circles under her eyes and how her coffee cup was always empty by second period. One time, I saw her in the grocery store. She wasn't wearing her usual stiff blazer, just a hoodie and jeans, and she looked normal. Tired but normal. She was standing in the checkout line, staring at the total on the screen. I saw her fingers tighten around her debit card before she forced a smile and swiped it. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she talking to on the phone that day? Who was she so afraid of? And why did I even care? She had humiliated me, made me dread her class. So why did I suddenly feel sorry for her? I thought about telling someone what I'd overheard, but what would I even say? Hey, my teacher's got some problems at home, and that's probably why she's mean to me? That wasn't exactly something you could report. Instead, I did something else. Something small. The next morning, when she walked into the classroom looking just as exhausted as ever, I held the door open for her. She barely even looked at me, just muttered, thanks, and went straight to her desk. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next few weeks, I kept doing little things. I stopped slouching when she spoke to me. I answered questions without mumbling. I nodded when she talked, just enough to show that I was actually listening. And slowly, very slowly, she started changing too. She didn't stop being strict, but she stopped sighing so much when I spoke. She still called on me at random, but she didn't make a show of it anymore. And one day, one single day when I got an answer right, she actually nodded and said, "Good work." It was the smallest thing in the world, but I swear, it meant something. I still don't know what Ms. Harper's secret really was. Maybe she was going through a divorce. Maybe she had money problems or a family situation she couldn't talk about. I never found out, and maybe I never will. But I do know this. Sometimes, the people who are the hardest on you are fighting battles you can't see. And sometimes the smallest bit of understanding, even if it's just holding a door open, can make a difference. Even if they never say it out loud. As the months passed, things between me and Ms. Harper settled into something different. She was still strict, still had that sharp tone that could cut through the classroom like a knife, but it didn't feel like she was out to humiliate me anymore. And maybe it was just in my head, but I felt like she started treating me a little differently too. Like when she handed back my assignments, she didn't slap them on my desk with that same exasperated sigh. Or when I asked a question, she actually answered it instead of making me feel stupid for not knowing. One day, something happened that really stuck with me. It was after school, and I had stayed late to make up a test. By the time I finished, the halls were nearly empty, and I was stuffing my books into my backpack when I heard something, low voices coming from the classroom next door. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except I recognized one of the voices. Ms. Harper. I hesitated for a second before stepping a little closer, just enough to hear. "I don't have it this month," she was saying, her voice low but tense. "I told you, I'm doing the best I can." Another voice, deep and rough, answered, but I couldn't make out the words. Then Ms. Harper again, sharper this time. "No, I don't care what he said. You tell him he'll get it when I have it." A pause. I don't know him anything. The conversation ended abruptly, and I barely had time to step away before Ms. Harper came storming out of the room, her face tight with anger. When she saw me, she froze for a split second. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't frustration or exhaustion. It was fear. Just as quickly, she covered it up, straightening her shoulders and giving me that usual unreadable stare. "Shouldn't you be heading home?" she asked. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, just packing up." She lingered for a second, like she wanted to say something else, but then she just nodded and walked away. That night, I lay awake thinking about it. That conversation, the look on her face. Who was she talking to? What did she owe them? And why did it make her so scared? I didn't know, but one thing was becoming more and more clear. Ms. Harper wasn't just a mean teacher. She was someone with real problems, things way bigger than a bunch of high school kids. And suddenly, I didn't just feel sorry for her. I was worried about her. A few weeks later, something happened that changed everything. It was a Friday, and everyone was counting down the minutes until the last bell. Ms. Harper was at the front of the class, but she seemed off. Normally, even when she was in a bad mood, she had this controlled, almost robotic way of teaching. But today, she kept losing her train of thought, staring out the window like she wasn't really there. Then, right in the middle of explaining something about quadratic equations, she dropped her marker. That wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that when she bent down to pick it up, her hands were shaking. No one else seemed to notice, but I did. She took a breath, straightened up, and turned back to the board. But before she could start writing again, her phone, usually buried deep in her desk, buzzed. Loudly. The whole class went silent. Ms. Harper stiffened, her fingers tightening around the marker. She ignored the call, but a second later, it buzzed again. And again. Then, out of nowhere, she slammed the marker down on her desk so hard it bounced onto the floor. "Class dismissed," she said abruptly. We all blinked. But someone started. I said class dismissed, she snapped. "Get out." No one argued after that. We all scrambled to grab our things and get out of there as fast as possible. But as I was leaving, I glanced back, and what I saw made my stomach twist. Ms. Harper was gripping the edge of her desk like she was trying to hold herself up. Her head was down, her shoulders shaking just slightly. I had never seen her like that before. And suddenly I realized something. Ms. Harper wasn't just having a bad day. Something was really, really wrong. I don't know what made me do it, but instead of heading for the bus, I lingered in the hall. I waited until the classroom was empty. Then, heart pounding, I walked back inside. Ms. Harper was still standing there, staring blankly at the desk. When she heard me come in, she quickly wiped her face and turned around, her expression snapping back to that cold, unreadable look. "What are you still doing here, Tom?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I hesitated. Then, before I could stop myself, I blurted out, "Are you okay?" For the first time ever, she looked surprised. She blinked at me, like she couldn't quite believe what I had just asked. Then she let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's none of your concern," she said. "Go home." But I didn't move. "Miss Harper, if someone's bothering you." She cut me off with a look. Not an angry one, but something more like warning. "Drop it, Tom," she said. "Please." That please hit different. I had never heard her say it before. I wanted to push, to ask more, but something about the way she looked, like she was holding on to her last shred of control, told me not to. So I just nodded. "Okay." For a second, I thought that was it. But as I turned to leave, she said something so quiet I almost missed it. "Thank you." It was barely a whisper, but I heard it. I didn't tell anyone what happened that day. I didn't go digging into her past, didn't try to play detective. But after that, Ms. Harper wasn't quite the same. She was still strict, still tough, but the sharp edges softened just a little. And when she called on me in class, there was something different in her eyes, something that almost looked like respect. I never found out what she was going through. Maybe I wasn't meant to. But one thing I do know, sometimes just letting someone know they're seen can make all the difference in the world. After that day, things between me and Ms. Harper weren't exactly friendly, but something had shifted. She didn't stop being strict, but the little digs and sarcastic comments, they stopped. And every now and then, when she called on me, I could swear she almost hesitated, like she was considering whether I really needed to be put on the spot. I never brought up what happened in that classroom. Neither did she. But something told me she remembered just as well as I did. Then, one day, she disappeared. It was a Monday morning, and when we walked into class, there was a substitute sitting at her desk. Ms. Harper's name was still on the board, her coffee cup still sitting on her desk, but she wasn't there. "Where's Ms. Harper?" someone asked. The sub glanced up from her notes. "She won't be back this week. No explanación. No warning. Just gone." I kept my mouth shut, but my stomach twisted. I thought back to that phone call, to the way her hands had been shaking, to the sharp pleas when I asked if she was okay. I didn't like this. Not one bit. She was gone the next week, too. Then the week after that. Rumors started spreading. Some kids said she had a breakdown and quit. Others said she got fired for yelling too much. Someone even started a ridiculous story about her being arrested for assaulting the principal. But I knew none of that was true. Because one day, I found out the real reason she was gone. The truth. It happened at the grocery store again. I was with my mom, helping her load bags into the car, when I spotted her. Ms. Harper. She wasn't in her usual blazer and heels look. She was in sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, and she was walking fast, keeping her head down like she didn't want to be seen. I almost didn't say anything, almost let her slip away. But something in me said I'd regret it if I did. So before I could stop myself, I said, "Ms. Harper." She froze. For a second, I thought she might ignore me, just keep walking. But then she turned, and when she saw me, something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe even a little panic. "Tom," she said, her voice cautious. I hesitated. You haven't been at school." She let out a short laugh. "Yeah, not really a secret at this point, is it?" I shifted awkwardly. "Are you okay?" Her lips pressed together. Then, after a moment, she sighed. "Tom, look, I appreciate the concern, but it's not something you need to worry about." I could tell she wanted to leave it at that, to just brush me off like she did before. But I wasn't letting it go this time. "You always tell us to push for answers when we don't understand something," I said, folding my arms. "So, I'm pushing." That actually made her smile. Just a little. For a long moment, she just looked at me. Then, finally, she exhaled. "I had to leave," she said, keeping her voice low. "It's complicated, but let's just say I was dealing with something that wasn't safe. And I couldn't stay in that situation anymore." I frowned. "You mean?" She cut me off with a look. Not angry, just firm. "I can't give details, Tom. But just know, it wasn't the school. It wasn't the students." She hesitated. "It wasn't you." That last part hit different. Like she knew I had been wondering. She glanced around, like she was making sure no one was listening, then added, I'm starting over somewhere new. Somewhere safer. I let that sink in. So, you're not coming back? She shook her head. No. I didn't know what to say. I had spent so long thinking of Ms. Harper as this unshakable force, this mean, untouchable teacher who lived to make kids miserable. But now, standing here in a grocery store parking lot, I realized something. She wasn't unshakable. She was just a person who had been fighting battles none of us knew about. A person who had finally decided to walk away. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. She studied me for a second, then gave a small nod. You're a good kid, Tom, she said. You're going to be just fine. And with that, she turned and walked away. I never saw Miss Harper again. The lesson she never meant to teach. The next week, the school announced that she had officially resigned. They didn't give details, just some vague message about personal reasons. A new teacher took over, one who smiled a lot and never raised her voice. Everyone seemed happy about it. But me? I kept thinking about Ms. Harper, about the way she had changed over the last few months, about the things I had learned, not from her lessons, but from her. She taught me that people aren't always what they seem, that the hardest people to deal with are often fighting the hardest battles, and that sometimes all someone needs is for one person to notice. I never told anyone what I knew about Ms. Harper, never shared the phone call I overheard or the conversation in the parking lot. But I never forgot, and I never will. A few months passed and life moved on. The new teacher settled in, and Ms. Harper's name faded from the halls. The kids who once mocked her had stopped talking about her altogether. It was like she had never been there. But I still thought about her. Not every day, but sometimes when I walked past her old classroom, when I saw a stack of graded papers on a teacher's desk, when I caught myself sitting up straighter in class without even thinking about it. It wasn't that I missed her, exactly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something important, something I was never supposed to see. Then, one afternoon, I found something that made me stop in my tracks. It was in the school library. I had gone in to grab a book for an assignment. And as I was flipping through the pages, a small folded piece of paper slipped out and landed on the table. At first, I thought it was just an old note someone had stuffed in there by accident. But when I unfolded it, my stomach clenched. It was a detention slip. And at the bottom, in small, familiar handwriting, was Ms. Harper's signature. I don't know why, but I just sat there staring at it. It felt surreal, holding something that had once been hers, something so small, so ordinary. And then, without really thinking, I took out a pen and wrote something on the back of it. Thank you. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was for her. Maybe it was for me. Either way, I folded the paper back up and tucked it between the pages of the book, knowing that someday, someone else would find it. And maybe, just maybe, they'd wonder about the teacher whose name was scribbled at the bottom. The teacher who had been strict. The teacher who had been feared. The teacher who in the end had just been human. Ms. Harper was gone. But the lesson she left behind? That would stay with me forever.